Hey everybody, and welcome to week 10 of Socratic Med's 15-week MCAT supplement course. My name's Chris. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about cognitive development and psychopathology. So just an introduction for Socratic Med. We are a grassroots nonprofit and we provide sensible solutions to students with disparate medical school opportunities. So we're basically just providing affordable prep for everybody. We're a really good resource. Everything is free. You can look at our Instagram, you can look at our YouTube. We do office hours and like 30-minute Zoom office hours as well with individual tutors. So if you are interested in anything that I just mentioned, you can go right to the bottom to this link tree. If you click that, it'll give you all of these links, and you can also join the GroupMe. You can sign up for those office hours. So if that's something you're interested in, please take a look. A little more personal, my name's Chris. I graduated from Stony Brook University in May of 2019. I was on a pre-medical track with a BS in Applied Math and Statistics. I took the MCAT in April of 2021 and I scored a 520, which was the 97th percentile. And I did get a perfect score on the psych and soc section. So my tutoring specialties are usually bio, psych, and soc. So today we are going to be talking about biology and then psychology. So we're going to start a little bit with cognitive development, and then we're going to talk about mental disorders and psychopathology in a little bit. There's a lot of material in this lecture, and it's pretty important stuff. So for the sake of time, I did throw a lot of information onto slides. So some of the slides may be very dense. So feel free to pause whenever you want. You can slow down the video if you want, if that's helpful for you. You can print the slides out. I didn't include any review questions this week, just because, like I said, for the sake of time, I just wanted to make sure I got everything out. So let's dive right in. We're going to start with Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So just a quick summary, Jean Piaget was a prominent developmental psychologist from the 20th century, and he developed a theory in which he split the cognitive development of humans into 4 sequential stages. So Piaget believed that human cognition grew from a restructuring of mental processes that resulted from biological maturation and input from the environment. So he didn't necessarily believe that small humans were just they were just little humans that thought the exact same way that adults did with less knowledge. He was really one of the first people to believe that their minds actually work differently, and that they would grow, and throughout their life they would acquire more. They would acquire like more matured mental processes as they aged. So the 4 stages that he divided child development into is the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, the concrete operational stage, and the formal operational stage. So the sensory motor stage usually lasts from about birth to 2 years. And during this stage, infants are pretty much learning about the world completely through their senses and completely through their motor skills. So the many cognitive abilities do develop during this stage since they're experiencing such rapid biological growth. And a couple of the important concepts that you should definitely associate with this stage. Object permanence is the understanding that objects or people still exist even when you can't see or hear them. So for example, a child that hasn't developed object permanence yet will think that a block disappeared if you hide it behind a wall. That's why, they are so amused when you play peekaboo with them, because they don't understand that you're still there even when they can't see your face. So object permanence actually does develop between birth and 2 years. And that's one of the bigger indicators that the child is progressing properly through the sensory motor stage. Self-recognition is also another phenomenon that we see during this stage. And it's the understanding of oneself, one's traits, behaviors, and feelings. So the child will actually become self-aware during the sensory motor stage as well. Deferred imitation is the repetition of an action at any point in time after the original action actually occurred. So it's a lot simpler just to imitate something while you're watching it, but this deferred imitation is also indicative that the child is developing cognitively, because they can delay that imitation. It's a form of learning. And representational play as well. It's pretend play during which a child uses objects symbolically to represent people, actions, and locations. So any sort of pretend play, if they're using blocks to represent people or to represent animals, that also develops during this stage. So during this stage, babies also may experience stranger anxiety, and that's distress when presented with an unfamiliar person. So after they start to accomplish all of these, they enter what we call the pre-operational stage, and that's usually from 2 years of age to 7. So during this stage, children begin to think about the world symbolically rather than relying solely on sensory information and motor functioning. So when we were in that stage right before this, they're pretty much just observing and learning about their world using their senses. They're not really capable of symbolic thought. They're not capable of abstract thought. But during the pre-operational stage, they start to think about the world symbolically. They can understand symbolic concepts rather than just having something in front of them, concrete. So children begin to use language and mental imagery to represent ideas in the world around them. And that is just one of the examples of them starting to understand the world symbolically. So the use of language is a use of symbolic information. Children are not yet able to think logically or critically. The world is only what they see, which means they don't really have higher thought processes yet. So what you see is what you get. That's the world that they understand, and that's the world that they're currently living in until they can develop they can develop biologically and start to understand more abstract concepts. So they demonstrate something called animism. And when we use the word animism in psychology, what we're talking about is the tendency to personify inanimate objects. So you see this all the time with child play. They may think that their doll is alive, or they may think that their stuffed animal of a dog is alive. And it's completely normal behavior. It's just indicative that the child is starting to think symbolically about the world, and that occurs during the pre-operational stage. And similarly, they're also going to experience egocentrism, sort of what we were talking about, where they're only able to understand what they see. So kind of similarly to that, they have this inability to recognize that others see the world from a different perspective. So they don't really understand the concept that other people are perceiving the world at the exact same time as them, but they're having a different experience. So if a child that has not been able to break this egocentrism, if they're watching a TV show, for example, and the mother is in another room, and the mother walks in, the child might ask the mother about something that happened on the TV show, because the child does not understand that because the mother is not in the room, that the mother is not seeing the TV. All the child knows is that the child is watching TV, so that's just generalized to everybody else because of this constraint of egocentrism. So the concrete operational stage is the third stage, and that's from about 7 to 11 years of age. So in this stage, children develop the ability to think logically about concrete events as opposed to abstract concepts. So they're not able to think about abstract concepts yet, but they can think logically. They're starting to problem solve about concrete events and concrete things in front of them. So during this stage, the concept of conservation arises. So what that means is children will understand that certain properties remain the same despite a change in appearance. So if you look down at the bottom, this graphic right over here, Piaget's conservation task, what he does is fills up two cylinders, A and B, fills them up with the exact same amount of water, and he'll ask a child, do these cups have the same amount of water? The child will usually say yes. He'll then take either A or B, the fluid, pour it into C, it's a taller, thinner cylinder, hold them next to each other, and then ask the child the same question. Do both of these contain the same amount of liquid? If conservation has developed, if they have reached that point in their development where they are able to understand that, they will answer and say, yes, there's the same amount, because they can understand logically, it tracks that the same amount of liquid in B is going to be the same amount of liquid in C. If they have not developed that, though, the fact that the liquid is so much higher in the container marked C than the container marked A, they might think that there is more liquid in C. So if they respond and say that there is more liquid in C, even though they saw B being poured into C, they have not yet developed conservation. But usually by 11 years, children are able to understand conservation, and it works for them. And children, again, begin to become less egocentric, and they begin to grasp mathematical concepts. And these are basic mathematical concepts, just like the 4 operations, and it's usually something very concrete. So we have to talk in analogies. So if we're talking about 10 minus 5, we'll say something like, I had 10 cookies and I gave 5 away. How many do I have? Because they have to have this concrete understanding of what they're doing. They're not able to really process these sorts of concepts abstractly yet. However, we get to the formal operational stage at about 12 years old. And during this stage, children are learning to reason abstractly now. So these are going to be about concepts and objects that are not actually physically present. So this is the start of true critical thinking, true abstract thinking. So for example, kind of like I just said, they will understand subtraction without having to set up the problem as taking away cookies from a friend. So instead of saying, I have 10 cookies and I take 5 away, how many do I have now? You can go to a 12-year-old and say, what is 10 minus 5? And they will understand, and they will be able to logically follow that in their mind without having to set it up against a concrete problem in the world. So adolescents are now able to think critically. They hypothesize about possible scenarios, and they understand moral reasoning more completely. So they can also construct and follow an argument without having to think in terms of example. So obviously, different arguments and different things that we say will vary in complexity in terms of their idea, in terms of how abstract they are. But up until this point, if you need to explain something to a child and they haven't really developed those abstract thinking skills yet, the best possible way that you can get it across to them is just by giving them example after example after example. Once they reach the formal operational stage and they start to develop that abstract thinking ability, you don't have to give as many examples, if at all. So depending on how complex it actually is, they will be able to construct and follow that argument in their own head. And we'll talk a little bit about a few other factors that are affecting cognitive development. So the effect of culture, for example. Humans are a product of their culture as much as culture is a product of them. So humans learn basic social skills such as language, and they develop more complex mental capabilities based on these building blocks. So one example of this is the phenomenon known as linguistic relativity. And I'm sure most people have heard this in a couple of different names, but it's the same thing. Wherein an individual's language directly affects or constrains their way of thinking. So language can even affect an individual's perception. It has been proven in some studies that speakers of languages that categorize colors more specifically are able to perceive those colors better than speakers of languages that lack the same vocabulary. So I put this picture of blue over here. I believe one of the studies, or the most popular study, was done in Russian because, if I'm not mistaken, there are multiple words in Russian that mean blue. They're different shades of blue and they have actual names, whereas a couple of other languages don't have multiple words for different shades of blue. So even in English, for example, we mostly just use the word blue, but that can describe a spectrum of different colors. So what this theory is saying is that our language and our vocabulary directly affects the way we think and the way we can perceive this. If there are more words that describe different shades of blue in our language, we are actually more likely to be able to perceive and recognize that as a different color compared to someone who speaks a different language. So culture definitely has an effect on, our cognition and our perception. Aging, of course, also has an effect on cognition. Cognition doesn't remain stable throughout an individual's entire life. Piaget has 4 stages, and the last one, of course, is formal operational, which is 12 and above, but it doesn't remain stable until death, usually, depending on how old the person lives. It's usually at about the age of 60, most humans start to experience some degree of cognitive decline. And for a lot of people, it's very slow and very steady cognitive decline. But, there are other cases in terms of, illness, Alzheimer's, where stuff like dementia can form. But interestingly, certain cognitive abilities are more affected by old age than others. So for example, recall becomes increasingly impaired, but recognition remains relatively stable. So recall is the ability to recall something from memory completely without a cue. So recognition is the ability to recognize something and identify it when you are presented with the cue. And recall, you have to be able to pull that from your long-term memory without the cue. So recall becomes increasingly impaired, but recognition from the studies seems like it actually remains relatively stable with age. Information processing abilities are also slowed in older adults. So anything having to do with processing any type of information. So it may take them longer to speak. It may take them longer to react. And it's just the natural process of aging. So heredity versus environment, or nature versus nurture. So nature and nurture work together to mold an individual's cognitive profile. In other words, people are born with genetic predispositions, but their social and cultural interactions encourage or discourage the formation of these certain mental capabilities. So genetic predisposition means something may be more likely to happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. It's a combination of genetic and environmental factors that actually mold that final product. So for example, if an adopted child whose birth parents are both statisticians finds himself in an underfunded school district with absentee parents, he may never develop the mathematical abilities of his birth parents. So if both of his parents are very good at math, we may be able to assume that they do have a genetic predisposition to math, to enjoy it. They have higher cognitive functioning. And there is a good chance that if both of them have that, then they would pass that genetic predisposition down to their child. However, if this child were adopted, or if the child were placed in foster care, was in an underfunded school district where he wasn't getting the right access to resources to improve this ability while he was growing, he may never develop those mathematical abilities. So he has the genetic predisposition to it, but the environmental factors aren't there. So it's a constraint. And similarly, a child who grows up in a wealthy school district and has access to private tutoring may still struggle with math because of a genetic predisposition. So then again, you could do everything right. You can have parents that hire private tutors. They go to a great school district. They're constantly emphasizing the importance of math in the child's life. Some children are just not going to get it because of a genetic predisposition. So it's a combination of both factors that form the final product. We also have biology, of course, that affects cognition. And when we say biology, we're talking specifically about the actual physical structure, the physical anatomy and physiology. So of course, the physical structure and health of our brains directly affect our cognitive and perceptive abilities. There is a condition known as agnosia, which is an inability to recognize objects despite sensory input being impaired. And this can often be explained by damage to the occipital and parietal lobe, for example. So we do know of conditions that are directly a cause, or I'm sorry, that are directly an effect of maybe lesions or scarring on specific parts of the brain. It's been thoroughly studied, especially with different agnosias. They can induce, scientists can induce lesions on the brain, temporary lesions even, just to see what abilities are impaired with it. So for example, the frontal lobe is involved in planning and organizing and inhibiting impulses, while the amygdala and the rest of the limbic system control emotional arousal, alertness, and motivation. So the interaction between all of the physical regions of the brain give rise to our cognitive processes. So we're using multiple parts of our brain all the time. So for example, if we're using the frontal lobe in planning and we are trying to figure out the best way to get across a bridge, say, we're going to maybe look at the bridge, see where its weak spots are and say, okay, don't jump there, don't jump there. Our amygdala is activating as well, and it's saying, do not jump there, that's scary, you could fall. So it really is a conglomerate of different parts of the brain that all work together that really give rise to all of our cognitive processes. Okay, so we're going to talk now about some theories of intelligence. We'll start with the early ones, and then we will, make our way to modern day. So the concept of intelligence is a human creation. So just keep that in mind as we are studying all of this, because a lot of different people have a lot of different definitions for what intelligence is or how to define it. One formal definition lists it as the ability to solve problems and use knowledge or experience to adapt to new situations. So throughout the 19th and 20th century, psychologists have come up with differing theories on how to describe or quantify intelligence. And you can see they sort of jump off, they're sort of stepping stones from one theory to the next. You can sort of see how it changes throughout the 19th and 20th century. But different psychologists, even still to this day, will have very different definitions of what intelligence actually what it is, because it is a social construct. So even if you look at these early theories of intelligence, they were more focused on trying to find and quantify this singular number known as general intelligence, whereas a lot of the theories today have it split into different into different sections. They're very multifaceted today compared to the ones that were in the 18 and 1900s. So in the mid 1800s, Francis Galton proposed theory of general intelligence. In this theory, Galton thought that there was one general form of intelligence and that it was heavily determined by genetics. So he basically thought that intelligence was a cognitive process, just like anything else that we would do. We use language, we have intelligence, we run, we walk. He wasn't really interested in figuring out what intelligence was, where it came from. He was just trying to figure out pretty much how to quantify it, or if it were possible to quantify it. And there were a lot of flaws in his methodology, and there are a lot of implications even to this day of some of his work. So for example, he did not take into consideration environmental factors when determining intelligence, and he operationally defined intelligence as reaction time. So what that means is when he was conducting his experiment, you have to operationally define all of your variables. So that means giving a quantitative value to define a specific variable. So he was trying to measure intelligence, and he said, how can I quantitatively measure intelligence? And he thought that reaction time was the best possible way to determine an individual's intelligence, which to today's measures is laughable, but that's the way he was thinking about it. So Francis Galton's his theory greatly contributed to the rise of eugenics as well, and the categorization and ranking of races by genetic superiority, which again, to today's standards, is just completely ridiculous and just a heinous thing to even think about. But that was his thought process, and a lot of his work. A lot of his works were inaccurately cited in a lot of eugenics campaigns, a lot of genocides, a lot of atrocities that went on during immigration in the 19th century. So he has a lot of lasting cultural implications. It's very interesting to read on. It explains a lot, actually. So moving forward from that, though, Alfred Binet sought to devise a way to test the intelligence of French school children in the early 1900s to determine which children needed special education. So Galton's his motivations weren't the greatest, but it seemed like Alfred Binet's motivations were a little bit better. He was just trying to quantify intelligence to see how they could better help school children and try to decide which school children actually needed special education. So his test was later revised by a psychologist at Stanford University, and it became known as the Stanford Binet test. And that was more commonly known as the intelligence quotient test, or the IQ test. And there are still, even to this day, there is still a lot of IQ tests that you can take. Generally, they are thought not to be the most accurate way to measure intelligence because, again, what really is intelligence? But people do use them in practice. You just take them with a grain of salt, and you have to understand what they're telling you. Charles Spearman was another psychologist in the early 1900s who actually coined the term general intelligence. And he, again, thought that there was a singular quantifiable variable that he referred to as Spearman's G. So Spearman, like Binet, yes, believed that he could be quantified by testing. Okay, so now we're starting to deviate a little bit away from that that idea that there is a general intelligence. So as psychologists began to understand the shortcomings of these theories of general intelligence in the early 20th century, they began to devise more complex theories to explain it. Because again, they were looking at all of these theories and they were seeing so many problems with it. So for example, with Galton's theory, if we say took an immigrant from a lower socioeconomic status and gave them the same exact test that was developed in America, we gave that test to someone who was from the upper class of America, that person in the upper class is going to do a lot better than someone who has absolutely no cultural context and has absolutely no schooling to do it. So it's just not a good way to measure intelligence. Raymond Cattell, however, came up with a model that splits intelligence into two types. So fluid intelligence, GF, and crystallized intelligence, GC. So fluid intelligence describes our ability to think quickly and solve novel problems. So that's basically our critical thinking skills, our on-the-fly thinking, our ability to think about that. So crystallized intelligence describes our ability to recall and apply already learned knowledge. And his theory is also very interesting, and it's still used today as well, especially in school. If you're ever interested, in school, just sort of the theories that they use to teach. One of the biggest debates is the importance between aptitude and achievement. So aptitude meaning how your ability to learn new information, and achievement means your ability to apply past information to new problems. So that sounds pretty familiar to me. Fluid intelligence would be sort of parallel to aptitude, and crystallized intelligence would sort of be parallel to achievement. So super interesting stuff, I think. And this brings us to the present, Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. So in the late 20th century, Howard Gardner proposed his theory of multiple intelligences. So in it, he described intelligence as being made up of 8 modalities. So we went from 1G to 2, and then Gardner split it up and said, no, there are 8 modalities. There are different ways in which people can be intelligent. Because again, we don't really have a specific definition for what intelligence is. So Howard Gardner, was thinking more along the lines of intelligence is a proficiency in a certain skill. So if we break it down to the most basic skills, what facets, what modalities can humans be intelligent with? So he broke them up, and his 8 modalities were logical, linguistic, spatial, musical, kinesthetic, natural, intrapersonal, and interpersonal. So intrapersonal is also sometimes known as emotional intelligence, and interpersonal is also known as social intelligence. So Gardner's theory is still employed today by some teachers and caregivers, and a lot of people use it, especially when they're coming up with caretaking plans for growing children. And the theory revitalized a lot of interest in social and emotional intelligence in the late 1990s. Because again, that was something that was not studied. That was something that was not even considered in the early 1900s and the late 1800s. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit now. I'm not going to talk so much about development anymore, and we're going to talk more about psychopathology, also known as psychological disorders, abnormal psychology, but I prefer the term psychopathology because it's not as stigmatized, and it sort of has more of an objective feel to it, so we can sort of look at it objectively. So about 1 in 4 American adults meet the criteria for a psychological diagnosis, but the majority of these, they're usually just like depressive and anxiety disorders. They're not severe disorders that would, warrant hospitalization or would even warrant them to get arrested. It's more along the lines of about 6% of Americans that suffer from really serious illnesses that require immediate attention. But they are very widespread. Many people experience them, and we still know relatively little about them. So psychopathology is a set of behaviors and or thoughts that do not align with cultural norms and can cause significant distress or impairment in functioning. So the current paradigm through which we seek to understand psychopathology is known as the biopsychosocial approach. So there have been a bunch of paradigms that people have tried to understand psychopathology through. And this seems to be the best approach. And basically all it means is that we cannot explain psychological disorders with only biological means. So some people may try to look into the brain and see that it 100% completely explains and can predict psychopathology, but that's just not true. And it's the same exact thing. We can't just look at the psychological part, and we can't just look at the social interaction part. It's a complex interaction between these 3 factors that give rise to the biopsychosocial approach, and it gives rise to our understanding of psychopathology. So classification and DSM, it is important to keep in mind that classification of disorders are a human invention. Any sort of classification of any sort is a human invention, kind of just like we were talking about intelligence before. So again, things can get very subjective, but the main goal is to try to classify things that we understand so that we understand them better. And in the United States, our diagnoses, we use DSM, which stands for Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So currently, mental health practitioners in the United States diagnose using the DSM-5, which was published in 2013. So diagnoses in the DSM are reached by analyzing a list of polythetic criteria. So what that means is, for example, a specific diagnosis may list 10 possible symptoms, but the patient may only need to exhibit 5 of them to qualify for the diagnosis. So there aren't super strict diagnosis criteria. On certain disorders, there are certain criteria that have to be met in order for the diagnosis to be used. But again, it sort of just reflects our understanding of psychopathology. There are just a wide range of symptoms for a specific condition that someone may or may not experience. So this, as of right now, seems to be the best structure for diagnosing. So you should familiarize yourself with the following 9 categories of psychological disorders. You don't have to know them. You don't have to be able to name all 9 of them. But if you read them, you should know what they are, and you should probably know at least 1 or 2 of the most common examples, the actual disorders. So basically, for the rest of the lecture, we're just going to go through all of these different types of disorders, and we're just going to give quick examples and talk about them. So we have anxiety disorders, OC and related disorders, trauma and stressor, somatic symptom and related, bipolar, depressive, schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders, dissociatives, and personality disorders. So we'll start, just going to group them together in 3s. So we're going to start with anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, and trauma and stress related disorders. So anxiety disorders, these are the disorders that most people are familiar with at this point. These are those in which the patient experiences intense, frequent, and uncontrollable anxiety. So anxiety is a state of unpleasant mental and physical arousal, as I'm sure every single person who is watching this video has experienced at one point or another. It's not comfortable, it's not a fun experience, but it is normal and it's necessary for humans. It becomes pathological when it causes significant distress and it impairs normal functioning. So we need anxiety to survive. It helps us avoid bad situations. But when there's no root of the anxiety, or when it becomes pathological and it affects our daily lives, that's when it becomes a disorder. So it's the same thing with panic disorders. A person with panic disorder has experienced at least one panic attack and worries about having more. So panic attacks are acute experiences. They come and go. They usually last about 30 minutes, but they are, again, extremely uncomfortable. They can be very terrifying for the person experiencing them. And during that, the person may experience a variety of psychological and physical symptoms, and it's usually the physical symptoms that are the scariest. And these can include, but are not limited to, heart palpitations, shortness of breath, chest pain, a feeling of intense dread, sweating, chills. So a lot of time panic attacks get confused as heart attacks, and they send people to the emergency room. So if there's no like physiological basis for the chest pain or for the shortness of breath that the person was experiencing, it's a pretty safe bet to say that it was just a panic attack. So if this person has a panic attack and then is completely preoccupied with this and just feeling terrified that they're going to have another panic attack, they'll most likely be diagnosed with a panic disorder. So it's not good. But the good thing is that panic disorders are usually very responsive to treatment, which is a good thing. So we have generalized anxiety disorder as well. We spoke a little bit about anxiety just now, but GAD is a disorder that causes one to feel tense or anxious about most things, but it doesn't cause panic attacks. So the source in generalized anxiety disorder, the source of one's anxiety may seem like it is constantly shifting or even unidentifiable. So you could just have this sort of generalized anxiety for which you have no idea where it came. You can have anxiety for one specific thing that you think is the root cause of all of your anxiety. And then once you solve it, you just realize that, nope, now I'm anxious about something else. So that is also a pretty common thought process for generalized anxiety disorder. And there are a wide range of symptoms for anxiety. A person may experience restlessness, poor concentration, irritability, insomnia. They could have a loss of appetite. Phobias as well are considered anxiety disorders, and a phobia is an irrational fear or an aversion to something that the patient fully understands is irrational. So that understanding that the fear is irrational does absolutely nothing to help the phobia. So they can often have evolutionary roots. A lot of really popular phobias, for example, are spiders. People are afraid of heights, maybe needles are another big one. And they're further divided into 4 categories based on their triggers. So situational, for example, some people may be afraid of bridges, or they may be afraid of very open spaces. Natural environment, maybe people are afraid of thunder or certain weather conditions. People can have a phobia of tornadoes, for example. Maybe they had a bad experience once. Blood injection injury. People, like I just said, will have like an irrational fear of needles, maybe, or just an irrational fear of seeing blood. Thinking about blood sometimes can even do it to people, and animal fears as well. So people can be afraid of dogs, spiders, lions, anything, any sort of animal. Social anxiety disorder is sometimes still referred to as social phobia. I believe in the past DSMs it was considered a phobia, but it's called social anxiety disorder now, and it's an unreasonable or paralyzing fear of socialization due to the possibility of humiliation or embarrassment. Social anxiety disorder can be really disruptive for people that have it, because it leads to this behavior known as avoidance. And that just reinforces social isolation. So if you look at the graphic that I have to the right, we basically start with anxiety. And if you don't actively work to get rid of your anxiety, it leads to this behavior called avoidance, which means whatever you pinpoint where your acute anxiety is coming from, and whatever that is, you avoid it. So for social anxiety, for example, if you are invited to a party, and you start to get really anxious the night of the party, and you start to think about all these interactions that you're about to have and the possibility that something's going to go wrong and that you're going to make a fool out of yourself, what might you do? You might call your friend and tell her that you're not feeling good and that you're not going to come to the party tonight. You'll immediately feel better, but that's avoidance. So you see right over here, we have the short-term relief. You're immediately going to feel better, but long-term anxiety growth. Your anxiety is going to get worse because of it's just operant conditioning. So you're going to be more likely to avoid situations that give you anxiety in the future. So it's a very bad, it's just a very bad cycle. So a lot of times the way that psychologists treat anxiety is just by treating it head on. So the next type of disorders are obsessive compulsive and related disorders. So obsessive compulsive disorder is a condition that causes the individual to have obsessions, compulsions, or both, which is an important part of OCD. You don't have to have both obsessions and compulsions. Sometimes the compulsions are not present, but obsessions usually are, just be based on the definition of what a compulsion is. So an obsession is a repeated and intrusive thought that causes distress and anxiety. So any sort of thought that is repeated and intrusive, it could be anything. So for example, one of the most popular ones, or one of the easiest to understand, you can have an obsession, this intrusive thought that your hands are constantly dirty. You might feel something on your hands. You might think about how dirty they are. You might think you smell something on your hands. And there's just this thought in your head all day running through your mind about how dirty your hands are and how you're touching everything and how it's getting dirtier and dirtier. So the compulsion is a repeated behavior to try to reduce distress or prevent a dreaded event from occurring. So the compulsion is being performed in response to the obsession. So if your obsession is that your hands are awfully dirty, you're going to be washing your hands, say. Maybe you go to the bathroom every 5 minutes all day long just to wash your hands, and you wash them for 45 seconds at a time, and you're rubbing your hands, scrubbing them down, and you're starting to blister your hands. That would be a compulsion. So that is what obsessive compulsive disorder is. The compulsion, that behavior, is you're trying to reduce the distress that is caused by those thoughts. And people with OCD, again, they understand that their obsessions or their compulsions are not reasonable, and they can't help it. That compulsion is really there to just try to get rid of that obsession. So again, it can be very destructive. And the third type of disorders in this group, trauma and stressor-related disorders. So similar to anxiety disorders, and they were actually once categorized as anxiety disorders, but they've since been separated in DSM-5. These disorders are usually a response to a traumatic event, and can have other symptoms not usually present in anxiety disorders. So all those symptoms that we spoke about before are present in trauma and stressor-related disorders, but they will also experience dysphoria, aggression, dissociation. Those are just a couple of them. So the most popular or the most well-known disorder is probably post-traumatic stress disorder, and that often results in intense feelings of horror, fear, or helplessness after a traumatic event. So it's estimated that over 50% of people will experience a traumatic event in their lifetime, but only a small portion of the people that experience that event will develop this PTSD from that event. So those with PTSD are going to they may relive their trauma, usually through dreams, flashbacks. They'll sometimes have dissociative episodes where they are just completely cut off from reality for a little bit, and they are just stuck in a flashback, thinking about that traumatic event. So for a PTSD diagnosis, symptoms must be present for at least a month. So if they have these symptoms and it hasn't been a month yet, they cannot be diagnosed with PTSD. However, if they do have these symptoms, and it's longer than 3 days, and it's from 3 days to 1 month, they will probably be diagnosed with acute stress disorder, which is basically the same thing as PTSD. It just has not had a long enough time frame to actually become PTSD. So it's the same symptoms. The only thing that really differs is the time frame. So if these symptoms persist past 1 month, then that individual is most likely going to be diagnosed with PTSD. Then we have adjustment disorders, and those are the ones in which the individual experiences a maladaptive response to a stressor rather than a trauma. So it's basically PTSD, but we're not talking about a traumatic event. So a traumatic event would be something like, we talk about veterans all the time with PTSD. Traumatic event would be, watching one of your friends get killed to the right of you. When we say stressor, we're really talking about daily stressors. So a romantic breakup, say, maybe issues in the workplace, anything like that would be considered stressors, but we still do have pathological responses to them. So these adjustment disorders usually don't last as long as PTSD as well, just because the trauma obviously is it's a lot more powerful than just daily stressors, but adjustment disorders usually last about 3 to 6 months. And it's important to note that individuals with lower socioeconomic status are much more likely to be diagnosed with these kind of disorders, with trauma and stressor-related disorders, because they encounter more stressors daily. So the next couple of types of disorders we're going to be talking about: somatic symptom disorders, bipolar and related disorders, and depressive disorders. So somatic symptom and related disorders. Somatic symptom disorders are those characterized primarily by distress and decreased functioning due to persistent physical symptoms and concerns. So somatic meaning body. These disorders usually have something to do with an actual illness or a perceived illness. So these symptoms are usually not rooted in any detectable physiological disturbance. So the 4 subtypes of these disorders are somatic symptom disorder, illness anxiety disorder, conversion disorder, and factitious disorder. So in the first one, somatic symptom disorder, a person will complain about one or more, usually chronic physical symptoms, regardless of any physiological basis. So chronic headaches, for example, if a person gets chronic headaches, and they are constantly preoccupied with this, and it's causing them stress and it's causing them distress thinking about the fact that they have these headaches and how much it's taking away from them, it's going to increase that anxiety. And the diagnosis requires the presence of reduced functioning due to the anxiety over the perceived illness. So that's the biggest part. If the anxiety over the perceived illness, it doesn't even have to be, doesn't even actually have to be a debilitating illness. It's just the individual's perception of their own illness causes them anxiety. That's the basis for somatic symptom disorder. Then we have illness anxiety disorder, which is similar to somatic symptom disorder, but the somatic aspect is not the focus of the diagnosis. So it doesn't really even matter. And a lot of times people with illness anxiety disorder may not even have what they're saying they have. They are just so anxious about their health. Just as a general person, a character trait, the distress comes from the person's anxiety about their own health. We also have conversion disorder. That's one in which the person experiences changes in sensory motor functioning without a discernible physiological cause. So symptoms typically begin after emotional conflict or a stressor is presented. Glove anesthesia is an example. So there have been multiple examples of a person completely losing feeling in their hand, in their entire hand. However, no other part of their arm is affected, which is not the way that your hand and your arm is innervated. It's innervated in different sections. So one nerve that goes, say, up the right of your arm will innervate the right part of your arm as well, will innervate the right part of your hand as well. So if there's something wrong with the nerve input, then we would assume that the entire part of the arm is experiencing, some sort of harm, but it's not. In the case of conversion disorder, it's a very atypical pattern of anesthesia. It's just the person's entire hand is just completely anesthetized, and there's no physiological cause. So that's why we would term it conversion disorder, because it has to do psychologically. And then factitious disorder, an individual will fabricate an illness and will either falsify information or cause harm to induce an injury or an illness. So this can be imposed on a person, like on oneself or on another. And this is more commonly known as Munchausen or Munchausen by proxy if it was done on someone else. So a person can do this to themselves. The actual DSM terminology is known as factitious disorder imposed on self, or to someone else, and it's usually a child. And then in that case, it would be considered factitious disorder imposed on another. So the diagnosis requires this behavior even when there is no obvious benefit. Now we have bipolar and related disorders. So bipolar disorders are those in which people experience cyclic mood episodes. So that oscillate between 2 poles. And the 2 poles that we refer to are depression and mania. So during mania, that should say a manic episode. During mania or a manic episode, a person may experience an increased energy, impulsiveness, irritability, euphoria, psychomotor agitation, and an increase in goal-directed activity without necessarily having the focus to complete on it. So psychomotor agitation also just means maybe you're sort of jittery, you have sort of movements that don't really make sense, you might be fidgety. So all of these all of these are evidence of mania or a manic episode, and they can really vary in terms of subjective experience for the person experiencing them. Sometimes people objectively like having manic episodes, because there is sometimes a euphoria associated with it, and they feel so productive. So these people will go maybe a week with having 2 hours of sleep a night. Maybe they'll go to the gym for 5 hours and just do something that is super productive, but it's not healthy. It's not a sustainable behavior, and it's not healthy. These symptoms must be present for at least 1 week to be considered a manic episode. And during these episodes, the individual may feel energized on 2 hours of sleep and may experience psychotic features that could lead to hospitalization. So there may be some positive symptoms that we will talk about when we discuss schizophrenia, but those sort of symptoms may be present during mania as well. And then on the opposite end, we have a major depressive episode. And in one of those, a person experiences a depressed mood for at least 2 weeks, as opposed to mania, which only needs to be 1 week, remember. And they experience at least 5 of the following symptoms. So we have depressed mood, decreased interest in activity, significant increase or decrease in appetite, excessive or insufficient sleep, agitated psychomotor ability, fatigue, feelings of low self-worth, excessive guilt, impaired concentration or decision-making, and thoughts of death or suicide. So it's really interesting that when you read this symptom list, a lot of the paired symptoms are complete opposites. So significant increase or decrease in appetite, excessive or insufficient sleep. And that's just kind of more evidence for the biopsychosocial paradigm, where even if there is just one biological root, it's going to affect everybody differently because of the psychological and the social component. So whereas one person may be experiencing an increase in appetite during their depressive episode, another person may not want to touch food and not eat for 3 days. So we experience everything differently. So bipolar 1 disorder is diagnosed when an individual meets the criteria for a manic episode not caused by a medical condition or medication, because there are certain medications and there are other medical conditions, somatic medical conditions, that can create behavior that seems manic, that mimics a manic episode. So although bipolar 1 will usually include a full depressive episode or a moderate depression, a person may still receive a bipolar 1 diagnosis in the complete absence of depressive behavior. So in order to be diagnosed with bipolar 1, all you need is one manic episode. If a person has a manic episode, they will obviously be screened for other conditions. They'll obviously be screened and asked if they did ever have depressive episodes, if they had ever had moderate depression or anything like that. But regardless of if the depression is present or not, if the person has a manic episode or a mixed episode, they meet the criteria for a bipolar 1 diagnosis. So a mixed episode, like I just said, is an episode during which they meet the criteria for a depressive and a manic episode, and their symptoms are present nearly every day for at least a week. So as long as a manic or mixed episode is present, bipolar 1 diagnosis is feasible. Bipolar 2, however, is used to diagnose a condition in which the person has experienced a major depressive episode and a hypomanic episode, but does not meet the criteria for a manic episode. So hypomania is just a less intense form of a manic episode. Sometimes it could last a little bit shorter. The symptoms are not as severe, and sometimes there are less symptoms that are present, but basically it's the same thing. It's just probably not as disrupting as a manic episode. So if a person, say, is suspicious that they have experienced the manic episode or even a hypomanic episode, they may go to a psychologist, explain their experiences. If they don't meet the criteria for a manic episode, they most likely will meet the criteria for a hypomanic episode. So it's not enough to just have that hypomania for a bipolar 2 disorder. You need a major depressive episode as well. Whereas we just said before, bipolar 1, all you need is an episode of mania. So bipolar 2, you need major depressive and a hypomanic episode. And then the third one is cyclothymic disorder. Sometimes it's referred to as cyclothymia. And it's similar to bipolar, but the individual experiences less intense symptoms for a longer time. So they're basically alternating between hypomanic episodes and mild to moderate depressive episodes, pretty much for years it could be. So they should meet the criteria for alternating, that are never absent for more than 2 months over the course of over 2 years. So as long as it occurs for more than 2 years and there has never been a break that is longer than 2 months, they will probably be diagnosed with cyclothymic disorder. Okay, so we have some depressive disorders. So depressive disorders affect an individual's mood to the point that it causes significant personal and/or interpersonal distress. So in major depressive disorder, a person has suffered at least one major depressive episode. So these symptoms do not constitute major depressive disorder if they occur within 2 months of bereavement, because depression, depressed mood is considered to be just a normal process of bereavement, and it's a normal way we handle grief. The issue is that if it persists longer than we can explain it, psychologists would probably start to look toward major depressive disorder. So depressive episodes may also be influenced by the seasons. What was once referred to as seasonal affective disorder is now known as major depressive disorder with seasonal pattern. Persistent depressive disorder, which is formerly known as dysthymic disorder, is a less intense but chronic form of depression. So people with PDD will experience mild depressive symptoms constantly for at least 2 years, but without the presence of major depressive episode. So we had cyclothymic disorder on the other page. Cyclothymic disorder was sort of like the lighter version of bipolar. Persistent depressive disorder is sort of like the lighter version of major depressive disorder, where it's just this sort of less intense depression, but it goes on for a very long time. So this diagram to the right, you can take a look at if you'd like. It's just the M and D to the left on the y-axis just means mania and depression. To the right, you see the type of disorder we're talking about. And this basically just maps a person's, basically just a person's state throughout time. So bipolar 1, for example, you see that there are multiple manic episodes over here, and this person is also experiencing depressive episodes. They don't need to have experienced these 3 depressive episodes to be considered bipolar 1, however. So this line on this top one could actually not even ever cross this x-axis, and we would still consider it to be bipolar type 1. If we move over here and look at this mood state, bipolar type 2, you have these small peaks. Those are indicative of hypomanic episodes. So if you look up here, back at bipolar 1, we have these larger peaks, which are clearly indicative of mania. These are not as tall, so we would assume that they are hypomanic episodes. However, when we look at the bottom, these are some pretty deep peaks over by the D. So we know that those are depressive episodes. And again, we need a hypomanic episode, at least one hypomanic episode, and at least one major depressive episode to be diagnosed with bipolar 2. And then we have unipolar, which is just major depressive disorder. Unipolar meaning is just depression without mania. And you can see it stays below the whole time, picks up a little bit. It is cyclic in nature as well. And even towards the end, the person is a little bit above the middle. So maybe that person is seeking treatment and maybe it's working. All right, so schizophrenic disorders and dissociative disorders. Schizophrenia spectrum and psychotic disorders, positive symptoms. So I wanted to break them down. When we talk about schizophrenia and these disorders, we usually categorize symptoms into 2 categories. We have positive symptoms and negative symptoms. So to fully understand this, we must understand the definition and grouping of these symptoms. So positive symptoms are changes in thoughts and behaviors that are added on to a person's normal functioning. So that will become a little bit more clear of what that means when we discuss the actual symptoms. So some positive symptoms are delusions, which are deeply held beliefs of altered reality despite contrary evidence. So, for example, a person with schizophrenia may be walking down the street and they pass someone on the street that doesn't look at them, doesn't make eye contact with them, doesn't say anything. They could even be on a cell phone in a different conversation. And that person with schizophrenia is going to believe that, I don't know, maybe that person was flirting with them or something like that. So delusions are just these altered beliefs that really have no root in reality. Hallucinations are sort of like delusions in that they have no root in reality, but hallucinations are really regarding the perception of sensory information. So for example, a really common type of hallucination that you see during schizophrenia are auditory hallucinations. A lot of people who have schizophrenia report hearing voices inside their head or hearing a specific voice inside their head without sensory input. So those are the auditory hallucinations. Disorganized thinking, which is we're usually able to tell through the person's speech. When their thought is disorganized, their speech will also be disorganized. And we also have disorganized motor behavior, psychomotor agitation as well. So negative symptoms, on the other hand, are changes that take away from an individual's normal functioning. So negative symptoms, for example, could be a flat affect, which is a decrease in emotional expression, just a complete straight face, regardless of what type of emotion the person is experiencing. Avolition is the lack of motivation or purpose, and alogia is decreased or absent speech. So these are all negative symptoms, and you can see, because if we take the normal state, we look at the normal state of each, we're taking something away. So we consider these to be negative symptoms. So schizophrenia is diagnosed when someone experiences positive and negative symptoms for at least 6 months. These disorders are generally characterized by a distancing of the person from their everyday reality. So these disorders are they're very, very disruptive. And also just a quick note, schizophrenia is not a split personality disorder. DPD is actually a dissociative disorder that we'll talk about in a minute, but that's a very common confusion, that people think schizophrenia means split personalities, which it does not. So dissociative disorders. So in a dissociative disorder, people may lose conscious awareness. They may lose control of their thoughts, perceptions, and emotions. It's just sort of splitting from reality, basically. These disorders result in extremely intense dissociative episodes, and it's usually triggered by severe stressors, even trauma sometimes. So dissociative identity disorder, formerly known as split personality disorder, is one during which at least 2 separate personalities are alternated. So there are at least two different personality states that they will say and maintain that they are 2 different people. So identities may vary in age, gender, personality traits, and a switch to a new personality is often accompanied by amnesia. So if they switch personalities and they were with the other personality for the last 4 hours, the new personality that switches out will not have memory of what that other person did, because they believe that they are 2 different people. DID is kind of controversial, and there are even some psychologists that are extremely weary of its existence and have never seen it in person. So that's sort of a controversial diagnosis just in and of itself. Dissociative amnesia, the individual has at least 1 episode of forgetting important personal information, and it creates memory gaps usually related to severe stress or trauma. So if during a dissociative episode, a person's wandering aimlessly, they are said to be in a dissociative fugue. So one of the diagnoses in DSM-5 is dissociative amnesia with dissociative fugue. So if someone forgets where they're walking, forgets what their goal is, just wandering aimlessly, that's called dissociative fugue. So the condition usually begins and ends suddenly, dissociative amnesia, and the memories often come back after it. But the issue with that is that if these memories are traumatic, a person may develop PTSD, because one of the reasons why they dissociate is to deal with that trauma. Not to deal with the trauma, but it's a way that they are not having to deal with the trauma, and a way that they're trying to forget it. So once it comes back, dissociation doesn't work and they're faced with the trauma, they could develop something like PTSD. And then we have depersonalization disorder. The person has a constant feeling that they're somehow detached to their physical body or their mental processes. So they may feel as they're an observer to their own self. So they will literally feel like they might not actually be seeing themselves in the third person, but it will feel like, this is not my hand. This is not me reaching for my glass. Someone is putting thoughts into my mind. For example, that's depersonalization disorder. It is dissociative. And derealization disorder is similar to depersonalization, but they may feel that people are objects in the external world are unreal. And they might know that the feeling is not accurate. So we call that reality testing, when a person is able to, maintain reality, and they're able to understand that something is real or is not real. So since that remains intact, the incongruence can lead to feelings of distress. So if they have this feeling that something's not real, and they know that that's not accurate, that's going to give this person even more anxiety, and it's going to give them feelings of distress. So that's one of the hallmarks of derealization disorder as well. And the last section that we're going to talk about tonight are personality disorders. So the personality disorders are actually split up into 3 groups. Personality traits are stable patterns of thought, feelings, and behavior. So when a person has a personality disorder, there is a stable pattern of behaviors that deviates from the cultural norm. It can impair functioning, and it causes internal and intrapersonal distress. So personality personality disorders create dysfunction in 2 or more of the following areas. So affect, cognition, impulse control, and interpersonal functioning. So the current disorders are divided into 3 clusters based on the types of behaviors demonstrated. So the first cluster we're going to talk about is cluster A. And these personality disorders are those that are associated with irrational thinking, social withdrawal, and suspicious behaviors. So in paranoid personality disorder, for example, the person is irrationally suspicious of others and often misinterprets others' motives to be deceiving or harmful despite any sufficient evidence. So these are the people, everyone is always out to get me. My friends, my family, everyone is out to get me, and it's just part of their personality. And it's very maladaptive, and it's very hurtful to interpersonal relationships. People like this, they have a very hard time keeping up their relationships because they're so paranoid. We also have schizoid personality disorder, which the person's usually a loner. They have little interest in any type of interpersonal relationship. They don't really care for friendships. They don't really care for their family relationships. They have no interest in romantic relationships. And a lot of times they're completely satisfied with that. It's not something that causes them distress. It's just the type of person that they are. It's just that's the way they see their personality. It's not distressing to them. However, they may come off as detached or cold to other people. So that's wherein I think DSM decided to consider schizoid personality disorder an actual disorder, because it's not directly causing the person stress, but it is impairing interpersonal relationships. So yeah, that would be considered disordered. And then we have schizotypal personality disorder, and the person will usually experience interpersonal issues again due to some or all of the following: limited or inappropriate affect, magical or paranoid thinking, odd beliefs, behavior, speech, or appearance. So these are the people that are, to their core, just different, very strange. They'll employ magical thinking. They have these really strange beliefs. Sometimes they dress in extremely bright colors. Sometimes they speak strange. They use, maybe their vocabulary is weird. Maybe they'll speak with a strange accent or something like that. And many of these cases actually eventually develop into schizophrenia, because a lot of positive symptoms that are present in schizophrenia are also present in schizotypal personality disorder. Okay, so moving on to cluster B of the personality disorders. So antisocial personality disorder is one in which a person will regularly display aggression against people or animals, deliberately destroy property, lie, steal, and intentionally violate rules. So a person must also have a history from the age of 15 of dishonesty, illegal activity, impulsiveness, and a lack of remorse. So there are a couple of childhood disorders that sort of indicate whether or not a person is at risk of developing an antisocial personality disorder. And it was, I believe, previously in DSM, there wasn't so much an antisocial personality disorder diagnosis as there was a psychopathy diagnosis. And psychopathy sort of is more so about the thought process and the cognition behind it, whereas antisocial personality disorder, we're really concerned with the behavior of the individual. So they are similar. A lot of people with antisocial personality disorder will probably also test very high for psychopathic traits, a lack of empathy, lack of remorse. But these, it usually affects men more so than women, and a lot of prison inmates are found to have antisocial personality disorder as well. So borderline personality disorder, a person suffers from instability in mood, impulse control, and image of himself or others. So an instability in all of those is basically what borderline personality disorder is. Shifts really quickly. The person may also have a terrifying fear of abandonment. They may develop self-harming or suicidal behaviors. There's increasing evidence that borderline personality disorder is actually a generalized form of bipolar disorder and a very severe form of it. Borderline personality disorder, I think, affects women slightly more than it does affect men. And we have histrionic personality disorder, which is kind of interesting. The person has a strong desire to be the constant center of attention through personal, and they accomplish this through personal appearance and seductive behavior. The individual may demonstrate very intense and dramatic emotions, but they're often shallow and fleeting. So sometimes it's very superficial. Their emotions are very much for show. Sometimes these people will misinterpret their relationships. They'll think that they have much deeper relationships with people than they actually do. But basically, they just need to be the center of attention, and they will do whatever possible to become the center of attention. And a lot of times, it's through seductive or sexual behavior. So in narcissistic personality disorder, the person feels extremely self-important, often experiences fantasies of beauty, brilliance, and power. This person feels a strong desire for admiration, and they characteristically lack empathy. So I'm sure everybody knows a person where you could self-diagnose them in your head with narcissistic personality disorder, but it can be an issue. Again, that person probably does not think that their personality is a disorder. Sort of like what we were talking about before with schizoid personality disorder. However, it does have a serious impact on interpersonal relationships. It's very much a turnoff for a lot of people when someone is so delusionally self-involved. So again, that's probably one of the driving factors behind why narcissistic personality disorder was classified as a personality disorder. And the last cluster is cluster C, which we have 3 more disorders. So in avoidant personality disorder, the individual may feel inferior and undesirable, and their fear of criticism or conflict leads them to avoid interpersonal relationships and new activities. So these are the types of people that do not have good self-esteem. It's basically the exact opposite of narcissistic personality disorder. They do not have good self-esteem. They are terrified of rejection. They are very scared of criticism. They're not good with conflict. And that leads them to avoid interpersonal relationships and new activities because they're so anxious about that all the time. So in independent personality disorder, the person feels the need to be taken care of by others and has an irrational fear of being left alone. So hence the name dependent personality. So they may not be able to make decisions. They're not good at making decisions. They feel more comfortable when other people make decisions for them. And they're desperately trying to seek the approval of others before they do anything. If they want to do something, they'll probably have a point person where they need to get that person's approval before they do something. Even if it has nothing to do with the other person, they just need that assurance that what they're doing is a good idea. They need that dependence on another person. So they're often taken advantage of because they will tolerate almost anything to gain support and avoid abandonment. So it can even go as far as abuse. They will tolerate it because they need that support and they so desperately need to be dependent on another person. So obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is cross-listed with the OC disorders, this is personality-wise. This is part of who they are. They have a very rigid, stubborn, and controlling personality. They'll resist authority. They won't cooperate unless they're in control. So when we colloquially use the word OCD, we are actually more accurately talking about OCPD because we discussed before about what obsessive compulsive disorder actually is, and it's not just liking things tidy. OCPD is more so like that. You're very rigid, you're very stubborn, you cannot take input from someone unless it is your input. You have to do things your way. You're going to resist authority, and you're not going to cooperate with anyone unless you are the one that is steering. These people can also be depressed and they can also have trouble expressing affection. So again, you can see why this is extremely detrimental to interpersonal relationships. So that was a lot of information that I just threw at you. If you have any questions, like I said before, I didn't put review questions in here just for the sake of time. I wanted to make sure, that I was able to finish all of this and that I didn't drone on about things that weren't important. But if you have any questions about any of the content, if you want to, if you're more curious about Socratic Med, if you want to sign up for some office hours or you want to be added to the group me, please don't hesitate. I put my email right there. You can shoot me an email. I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. Other than that, I hope you guys have a great night and happy studying.